just by way of introduction, SANBI is a public entity of the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment and was established in 2004. In terms of the governance structure, we report to the SANBI board, who in turn reports to the Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, Minister Barbara Creasy. Next slide, please. So this is just an outline of my presentation for today. I'll share with you very briefly South Africa's biodiversity profile. I have an echo, so I hope everyone can hear me clearly. And then about
SANBI from here.
Okay.
I was just put this.
All right. Then I will share with you SANBI's mandate in brief. So I'm only going to reflect on those mandate deliverables relevant to the theme for today. And then share with you SANBI's value chain, about how we work, our key research outputs, really just a snapshot of key research outputs and knowledge products, challenges and opportunities, and then biodiversity-related employment, and some key takeaways from the session. Next slide, please. So in terms of South Africa's biodiversity profile, we are a country that is rich in biodiversity. Our country is one of 17 megadiverse countries in the world. We are one of the top 10 for plant species richness, with the second highest plant endemism in the world. We have the third highest marine species endemism globally. South Africa is host to 3 of 35 biodiversity hotspots. The succulent Karoo, with the highest diversity of succulents in the world. And certainly it can be a blessing or a curse. We're currently in the midst of a severe succulent poaching crisis. And this is because of those precious, diverse succulents we have. Then there's the Cape Floristic region, characterized by the fynbos biome and the Maputaland, Ponderland, Albany hotspot. So with this rich biodiversity comes enormous responsibility. And then just to link back to the presentations of earlier this morning, and Professor Ndimba mentioned work on honeybush and rooibos. And these are, of course, indigenous species in South Africa. And then also, very importantly, the fruits that he spoke of, and of course, many of the vegetables are actually, they have to be, they come about because of the pollinators that we have in the country. And these, of course, are also part of our biodiversity bounty. Next slide, please. Next slide. I'm not sure why the slides are not changing, but the next slide is about SANBI's mandate. And I do hope that the organizers will change and move the slide. I'll carry on in the meantime. SANBI's mandate is derived from the National Environmental Management Biodiversity Act. So that is Act number 10 of 2004. The next slide, please. So part of the SANBI mandate is to manage and unlock benefits of the network of national botanical and zoological gardens. So we have both the botanical side and zoological. Undertake scientific research, monitor and report on the state of biodiversity, and provide science-based evidence to support policy and decision-making. We coordinate and provide access to biodiversity information and scientific knowledge, and provide science-based policy tools and advice for effective management of biodiversity assets and ecological infrastructure. And then we also are responsible for driving the human capital development in the sector, education and awareness in response to our mandate. We also provide technical or scientific support to the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment for all the multilateral environmental agreements or international conventions to which South Africa is a party. Next slide, please. So this is just the SANBI value chain, which really describes how we work. So at the bottom of this house is, of course, the foundation. And the foundations of biodiversity include our work on collections, taxonomy, maps, classification of ecosystems and species, genetics. And then we build on that and conduct assessments on some of those different areas like species and ecosystems. We look at trends, we conduct monitoring, conduct experiments and develop models. And this then feeds into policy advice, information for planning and tools and so forth. On the sides, the house is supported by two pillars. Of course, human capital development, a critically important pillar of the work we do, and then managing the biodiversity assets and spaces for conservation, as well as for public engagement and enjoyment. And we do this through our National Botanical Gardens, the National Zoological Garden, and their facilities. And all of this feeds then into our influence. And the spaces that we influence are streamlining environmental decision-making, ecosystem-based adaptation to climate change, investment in ecological infrastructure, harnessing our biodiversity value, and then a healthy environment. And ultimately, this is for human well-being, improved service delivery, and job creation. Next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of some of the knowledge products that support decision-making. And from top left to right, there's the red list of South African plants, conservation assessment of butterflies, and both of these products provide the threat status of species. Then we have the National Biodiversity Assessment, which provides the threat status and protection level of ecosystems. And then the report on the status of biological invasions and their management in South Africa. Then on the bottom left to right, we have the Species Environmental Assessment Guideline, Mining and Biodiversity Guideline, Threatened Ecosystems, which is also known as the Red List of Ecosystems. And it's really a comprehensive map. And lastly, the non-detriment finding, which is really a risk analysis of impact of international trade on species. And in this example, the species is the hippo. Then just to link back to Mr. Chauke's presentation of earlier this morning, SANBI developed a comprehensive map of the 22 strategic water source areas. That's the 10% of our land that provides 50% of our water runoff. So many of our outputs and knowledge products are achieved through a network of partners with whom we collaborate. We have a well-established citizen science network supported by the iNaturalist platform. We also convene communities of practice of scientists and conservation practitioners, and our products help to inform sustainable development. So, for example, the maps of biodiversity that also show our critical biodiversity areas are used by environmental impact assessment practitioners. And we know how important EIAs are for any development in the country. Next slide, please. So just in summary then, the key research outputs and knowledge products are in our foundational science, which covers botany, zoology, marine biodiversity, biobanks, genetics, and ecosystem classification. We have the assessments of biodiversity and species threat status, alien and invasive species, and also impacts of genetically modified organisms. We provide advice on the sustainable use of plants and animals. So, for example, the non-detriment finding for international trade. We also provide advice on the status of plants that are used, for example, the honeybush, rooibos, and so forth. Aloe plants that are used in the bioprospecting sector, and many others, including medicinal plants and so forth. Scientific services to wildlife industry and forensic investigations for enforcement agencies, and particularly because of poaching. So whether it's poaching of rhino or poaching of abalone, SANBI could do the forensic investigations that support the SAP's work. And then guidelines for decision makers, very valuable. So this is about taking the science and then making it more usable through these guidelines for decision makers. And of course, we produce peer-reviewed scientific publications, on average about 100 per year. Next slide, please. So just in terms of the challenges and opportunities, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, we currently have a broad program of research with varying degrees of capability. And in some subject areas, we have little to no critical mass. For example, in our work on impacts of GMOs and our work on bioprospecting, we have one scientific expert in each area. For estuaries and coastal work, we have no specialists within SANBI. And so we have to rely on our network of partners to bring some of this information into our national biodiversity assessment. Then we have no incentive funding streams for publications generated by researchers. So similar to the incentive provided for higher education institutions. We are sadly behind in terms of intellectual property protection and benefit flows. So we're working on finalizing our intellectual property policy and, of course, then its implementation. Efforts are also underway to strengthen the following key capabilities: transdisciplinary research, indigenous and local knowledge. We've just appointed our first ever Indigenous and local knowledge researcher. Sustainable use, we have a growing demand for research that supports sustainable use of all of our species, whether they are plants or animals. Biodiversity informatics, climate change and adaptation, and particularly impacts on biodiversity. GMOs, and here our first assessment of impacts of GMOs was focused predominantly on biodiversity, but we do need to extend that to broader environmental impacts. Then we increase our research collaborations to meet our sector needs and ensure continued human capital development. Of course, we are leading in the human capital development component of the sector. And we need to access funding to strengthen our key capabilities. And we do that not just through public funding, but also donor funding for a large array of projects that we have. Next slide, please. So, colleagues, this brings me to the important aspect of biodiversity-related employment, and it would be remiss of me not to really reflect on some of the figures that we have, given the theme of this session, our contributions to sustainable socio-economic development. So briefly, there are jobs that contribute to conserving biodiversity, such as protecting biodiversity, and we know the ranges, for example, at sandparks and in the various provincial nature reserves. There's restoring ecological infrastructure and functioning of ecosystems. And this is also very often taken through the Working For programs, which is a expanded EPWP kind of programs of work. Then we also have the professional services and research, which, for example, SANBI undertakes, but not only SANBI. All of the provinces also have scientific services that support environmental work and biodiversity. Then there are jobs that utilize biodiversity to support livelihoods and human well-being, such as biodiversity-based tourism and recreation, and the extractive use of resources like hunting and fishing. Next slide, please. So in terms of how many jobs are biodiversity related, the data provided is really from our National Biodiversity Assessment of 2018, and it is part of a SANBI fact sheet series. So we have the figures for jobs protecting biodiversity, over 20,000, over 36,000 jobs restoring ecological infrastructure, so many of those EPWP kind of jobs. And then the jobs in biodiversity research and professional services were just over 15,000. Over 90,000 jobs in biodiversity-based tourism and recreation. And then, of course, a huge component, over 256,000 jobs in the extractive use of biodiversity. So that being, for example, fishing and hunting and so forth. Next slide, please. And just by way of comparison, this slide really just shows that only 1% of government spending goes to biodiversity. But of course, there's quite a lot of funding that also comes from contributions from the NGOs and private sector, and of course, donor-funded projects that also make a substantial contribution to the biodiversity sector. So comparatively speaking, biodiversity provides for 418,000 jobs. This, of course, was in 2018. The figure may have changed somewhat, but is comparable with mining, which at the time had about 434,000 jobs. And then there are the tourism jobs, agriculture and manufacturing. And then the last slide, please. So the key takeaways from this presentation is really that South Africa's biodiversity profile provides a solid foundation for sustainable development. We provide evidence to support decision-making on biodiversity, and that is absolutely essential for the sustainable use of our resources. SANBI's research capacity needs to be increased to meet the sector needs, and we find that there are always growing needs and demand for more and more support by SANBI, whether it's to the national department or the provincial agencies responsible for the environment and biodiversity. And then very importantly, biodiversity provides jobs and supports human well-being, and therefore critically important that we conserve and sustainably use our biodiversity. Thank you so much for your attention.